And I would like to start out as is customary here in Australia by acknowledging and paying respects to the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm speaking to you, the Kabi Kabi people. I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and I wish to acknowledge any Indigenous people who may be gathered with us today. As we share our own knowledge, teaching, learning, and research practices, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. And I'd also like to thank Chris and Oliver for the invitation to speak at this wonderful event and for all the work that they've put into organizing it, and to those who've assisted as part of the Monash Warwick Alliance. Thank you so much. It's great to be here with you virtually. I'm actually in southeast Queensland, so it's early here and the birds are getting up, so you might get a little bit of the local sonic ambience. I'm going to put up some slides, and I hope my connection here works. So just one second while I pull this up. Apologies for this. Sorry, my connection might be a little bit slow. Is anything coming through? A little worried about that.
Yeah, we can see your slides, Mark, yes.
Okay, all right. For some reason, I'm getting the spinning beach ball of doom. Doesn't like switching to the slideshow. Well, so I'm going to start off by doing a brief aside on, there we go, thanks. This seems tangential to surveillance, but I don't think it is for the purposes of this talk and for the purposes of the themes of the conference. And it's an aside on thinking about the fate of language and, related to it, the fate of narrative within the contemporary technological imaginary. And haunting these thoughts on language is Donna Haraway's formulation in the Cyborg Manifesto on language and writing. Writing is preeminently the technology of cyborgs, etched surfaces of the late 20th century. Cyborg politics is the struggle for language and the struggle against perfect communication. And that formulation seems really important to me, thinking how those two struggles are actually aligned with each other. And I'm going to invoke a few recent examples of what I think is at stake in this struggle. Oops, sorry. I'm going to start with, some of you may remember Teju Cole, the author's drone tweets. I'm struck by these tweets because of the way in which they feature the impact of automation on narrative and storytelling. There are a series of tweets that start with well-known openings of novels, all of which are cut short abruptly by a drone strike. And you can take a look through these and recall what's being invoked. Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. Pity, a signature strike leveled the florists. Call me Ishmael. I was a young man of military age. I was elated at my wedding. My parents are inconsolable. So the message here, to me, I thought was quite interesting. The way in which automated preemptive intervention actually it interrupts and thwarts the unfolding of narrative. And I think there's some related points one might make about the fantasy that haunts some of the leaders of our current tech industries and their assault on or what I think of as a kind of an assault on or critique of the fate of language. Elon Musk predicting that human language will be obsolete in as little as 5 years. We can still do it for sentimental reasons. There's some audio on that, which I'm not going to play. I think it's the song Sentimental Reasons. It was, oh no, sorry, it was late. I was making slides. Mark Zuckerberg predicting an interface that would transcend language. You know what I think we're going to get to at the end of the line, past VR, I think you're going to be able to capture a thought, what you're thinking or feeling in its kind of ideal and perfect form in your head, and be able to share that with the world. So a kind of direct mind meld, presumably mediated by the Facebook infrastructure. The Nicholas Negroponte, the founder of the MIT Media Lab, predicted in a TED Talk that we're going to someday soon ingest information. We're going to swallow a pill and know English, and swallow a pill and know Shakespeare. It will go through the bloodstream, and it will know when it's in the brain. Sorry, I have something blocking my quotes here. This model of language as something that can actually be encoded and uploaded into our brains is a familiar sci-fi trope, but it also does something very strange to what we might think of as the role that language plays and how language actually operates. What would it mean to know English from a pill? How is that even possible? It's a particular way of thinking about language, which of course I think is allied with that perfection of code that Haraway is enjoining us to struggle against. And it also raises the question about what might be if that's in a sense, the consumption or experience of language, what might be the production of language under those circumstances? I was trying to think about that, and there's a William Gibson short story called The Winter Market about a new form of artist who directly transcribes her thoughts and fantasies and imaginings that can then be directly experienced, that's recorded, without using the medium of any other formation than presumably what's recorded from the brain. But something along those lines, or I suppose something along the lines of GPT-3, a kind of automated production of language that can then just be ingested directly. This is from GPT-3's Guardian article, a kind of gibberish composed of processing, millions of other similar articles. The notion that this is what language might become seems to align itself with the notion of Zuckerberg and et al. As how language might be experienced. I start all of that because I'm interested in thinking through the lens of surveillance, what happens when this way of conceiving of how information and language and representation function is brought to its culmination through forms of automation. And I'm going to use some terms, including operationalism, to describe the idea of systems that can operate directly on individuals and groups while bypassing the mode of representation. So to act directly upon individuals and groups rather than acting upon them through the medium of some type of a linguistic or representational frame. This Zizek quote kind of sums up that notion of a particular type of operationalism, although I'll use some other people to develop that particular term. So I'm going to figure the notion of automated surveillance within what I'm describing as cascading logics of automation. The process whereby automated forms of data collection lead to automated data processing, because once you collect these huge amounts of information, and I'm going to argue that automated surveillance relies on a model of information collection that's totalizing, which means that the goal is to collect as much as possible and hold on to it for as long as possible, and to process it in automated ways. Once you embark on automated data processing of huge amounts of data. The next logical step is kind of pressing towards the automation of response. And this is the kind of direct intervention of the automated system, bypassing, again, the forms of representation that arguably are associated with dominant frames of thinking about surveillance. When I read in the popular press over and over how the kind of new forms of total information collection and total monitoring constitute the culmination of panopticism, I think about how that's a complete misreading of how panopticism is described by Bentham by Foucault, but envisioned by Bentham operates. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. When I talk about automated surveillance, I'm going to use the notion of what I describe as the bias of automation to think about the characteristics of this type of surveillance. And I'm using the term bias here, not in the sense that we so often encounter when we talk about automated systems, the notion of automated bias by ethnicity or gender, or other categories along those lines, but rather a bias that's built into a system via the choice to implement it. And the inspiration here is Canadian media theorist or Canadian social theorist Harold Innis's notion of the bias of communication. Thinking through the lens of his critique of imperialism, he was interested in the ways in which particular media technologies were biased towards particular systems of control within the social relations in which they're embedded. So he was interested in how some media might be biased towards control over space. He's thinking of lighter media that travel rapidly over time, whereas other media might be biased to control over time. These are heavier, durable media that last over time. But the notion is that a particular technology would carry within it some form of bias. I'm going to use that notion, or borrow it, to describe these terms as biases of automation and to relate them to the forms of automated surveillance that I'm going to speak about. The first one, preemption, I juxtapose to prevention, and I'll explain what I mean by that. But preemption, I have that Amazon.com truck there because that image came out in response to Amazon's patent for anticipatory shipping, using data about your consumption habits to understand and predict what it is that you would want to consume before you know that you want to consume it. And then, their practical version of this patent is to distribute products in warehouses according to anticipated patterns of demand. But they also include in that patent the possibility that you might actually receive packages whose contents you do not know until you open them. And then upon opening them, you would realize that's what I wanted without having yet known that you wanted it. So that notion that your desire could be preempted has a particular resonance across the range of automated prediction systems. And I'm going to veer back and forth between a variety of different contexts, from consumption to policing, and in some cases even to military forms of violence, because I'm interested in the way in which I don't want to diminish the differences between those areas of the implementation of the technology, but I do want to note the shared logic that unites them in certain ways. When it comes to preemption, probably one of our more familiar contemporary visions of it comes from, and I hope the video is going to work because my connection is bad. It comes from predictive policing. And I'm interested in the temporality of predictive policing. So I'm going to play this video, see if it works. If not, I'll explain it to you. Whoops. Let's see. No, I don't think it's going to go. This is from a news story about now let's see if I can get out of it, about a predictive policing system in PredPoll that was developed by some academics, a combination of a mathematician and somebody who studied earthquake aftershocks, and was used to predict where criminal activity might take place in the city in which it's implemented, and to allocate forces directly based on those predictions. And the video is interesting to me because it features a moment in which the police arrive just in the nick of time to catch a crime that's about to occur. And that temporality seemed interesting to me because it has that kind of Minority Report logic to it. You've got to arrive. You can't come too early, I suppose, at least for the moment, because you need to be sure that the crime is going to take place. But of course, you can't come too late. So you have to intervene just in the moment of the emergence of the criminal activity. And the framing of PredPoll often invokes that particular version of temporality, the ability to intervene at the moment of emergence. And I'm going to define preemption in the sense that I'm using it as opposed to prevention, particularly around the frame of narrative and explanation. So if prevention, I'm thinking of, again, using the example of policing as something was familiar, if I'm going to juxtapose it to the PredPoll example, in the 1990s in the US around thinking about how to manage crime rates in urban environments. There was a block grant program that had identified one of the problems of street crime in urban environments, particularly committed by youth, as being related to lack of educational and recreational opportunities. And so some block grants were created to provide educational and recreational programs in the inner city devoted to inner city youth, with the idea that this might intervene in the incidence of criminal activity. Right? So there was a kind of causal explanation at work there, an implicit one that allowed for a type of political initiative as a response. And the goal, of course, was to, by understanding causal factors, intervene at the causal level and thereby, prevent or criminal activity, or at least lower it. By contrast, what happens in the 2000s is that block grant program gets dismantled, and a lot of the money goes towards technological infrastructure for policing, presumably some of that also moving in the direction of data-driven predictive policing tools. And so, if we contrast the temporality, one has, at least in the way I'm framing it, a slightly longer temporality, a bigger picture. The other has an emergent temporality. One thinks about a causal relationship that can be intervened upon. The other dispenses with the causal relationship and relies on correlation and prediction. And I think that has implications for understanding the politics of response to whatever social issue is being raised. In one case, the notion is that there's a way to modulate the variables that are causal. And the other, that is dispensed with in the interest of understanding that, well, this criminal activity is always going to happen. So what if we can just catch it at its moments of emergence and multiply our resources to be able to keep pace with whatever might happen in the arena? I'm going to say a couple of other things about the relationship between the temporality and the logics of simulation at work that relate to that last category, stasis versus perpetual intervention. So I'll just move through that. I see time is running out. There's an interesting potential contrast between how simulation operates in the classic, Baudrillardian version of simulation that derives from the logics of, Cold War mutual assured destruction. I'm using some movie reference here. Some of you may remember or have heard of the movie War Games, in which an automated nuclear war triggered by a computer that thinks what is a game is actually an attack from, can't can't remember what year it was, but Soviet Union or Russia, I guess it was pre-89. The machine is taught to simulate all of the possible outcomes of global thermonuclear war and realizes, as it puts it at the end, the only winning move is not to play. The notion that simulation, in this case, going through simulated futures would lead to a form of stasis, not playing. Oops. Oh, video is working there. So I'm gonna contrast that to simulation as preemption. Then I come back to those two slides. Another version of simulation, the one that we are becoming more familiar with in the era of automated surveillance, is simulation as preemption. Here, the goal is not to simulate a future in order to have a resulting form of stasis, but to simulate a future that can be acted upon constantly through ongoing forms of intervention, so that at any moment in which some type of concern pops up, this is the Minority Report version, as criminal activity emerges, it can be stopped in its tracks. So one version of simulation leads to a form of stasis, the other to perpetual, ongoing, perhaps accelerating forms of intervention. And I'm going to align that with two different models of surveillance. The first is panopticon. This is the reference back to what I'd mentioned earlier about my frustration with the notion that total surveillance is the culmination of the panopticon. I mean, perhaps, but it would mean rearranging its logics. As Foucault famously put it in his discussion of the panopticon papers, being watched all the time in the panoptic model is at once too much and not enough. Too much because the goal in the utilitarian frame that Bentham is operating is to kind of maximize the impact while minimizing the actual forms of harm. And his idea there was that if you could get people to internalize the monitoring gaze, surveillance would become automatic. In fact, done correctly over time, you wouldn't need to monitor people all the time. You may not even need to monitor them at all. The fantasy of a self-disciplining population is one in which the superintendent is no longer needed in the tower. It's one in which the mere spectacle of the tower itself instills a form of self-disciplining that operates automatically, as it were, without the intervention of a viewing subject. So being watched all the time is too much, assuming that disciplinary effects obtain, but it's not enough, because what triggers the disciplinary effects is the spectacle of surveillance. And we're familiar with that logic when it comes to, sorry, there are mosquitoes all around here. I'm outside in order to, because it's quite early here, so I'm getting a little auditory privacy. Sorry, my slides are sluggish. Whoops. So, this notion of the spectacle of surveillance, smile, you're on camera, here's the smoked dome, behave. It has a representational logic to it. It relies on a symbolic efficiency. It relies on the notion that the spectacle of surveillance will lead to the internalization of discipline. Whereas, of course, the form of total surveillance that is envisioned or anticipated by the technological imaginary actually relies on panopticism being at once too much and not enough. And I'm going to show a clip here, if I can get it to work, of a startup funded in part by Peter Thiel that's creating automated surveillance cameras that recognize potential threat based on machine learning and then intervene automatically in order to preempt
crimes. What we did is we looked at the current security surveillance market. All these cameras are basically just recording crime. All they do is give police information 24 to 48 hours later, once the crime is completely done. They're not sending the police any information in real time. And so we said, hey, how can we use artificial intelligence and cloud-based technologies to actually prevent crime and help save people's lives? We have created the next generation smart camera and alarm system. An Athena camera picks up dangerous objects and dangerous motions, such as someone pulling out a gun. It can then alert on that and contact either the business owner or a government official and have them voice into the camera.
This is Athena. I see you have a gun. Please stop committing a criminal offense. I have already called the police and they are on their way.
Whoops.
Crimes. What we did.
Yeah, that, I don't know. If you've seen the movie Demolition Man, there's a similar example of this taking place. But of course, it's being operated on an undisciplinable character who just kind of smashes the camera. But you know, that version of intervention, the voice that tells you to please stop committing a crime, it gestures in a direction I think that might be slightly more ominous. The framing is clear. I think what's being bemoaned is the purely representational character of the surveillance camera in this case. One, that it exists, you know, only as a particular type of symbol that might not be respected, and on the other hand, it's gathering you know, evidentiary information, but that's only after the fact. It can be used later, and that's something that's useless for the moment of the emergence of the criminal activity. So this is the difference between a camera that acts and a camera that simply records. The moment of temporality that I want to mark here, again, it's a preemptive temporality. This is just, you know, a little bit of hype that comes out of the company, but I think it's really telling. The software can detect that a fight is about to occur milliseconds after the first punch is launched, before it even lands on the victim. We're measuring the velocity of a punch. What does it mean to identify that temporal interval? I think all it can mean, or all it can suggest, I mean, maybe it's just hype, but what it gestures towards is an interval in which preemption might take place, but only in the automated register, right? There's no time to alert authorities in that particular interval. But it does open up the technological imaginary to thinking, what might automated intervention in those milliseconds between a punch launched and before it lands look like? Sorry, get back to the slides. There's a little bit of a lag in my... So, sorry, it's my connection. To avoid messing with the slides too much, I'll just say, you know, what I was interested there is in the version of kind of post-representational surveillance is one in which Foucault's description of the panopticon is inverted. It's not being watched all the time that's at once too much and too little. It's panopticism itself, which is at once too much and too little. Too much in the sense, well, let me start with too little. Too little in the sense that it's not enough to just watch people selectively or not watch people at all. They need to be watched all of the time to catch emergence, where any moment is a potential moment of risk or criminality requires perpetual, comprehensive monitoring. Once that's in place, you don't actually need people to know that they're being monitored. In fact, it might work better if they don't know that, because their behavior won't be in some way impacted by the knowledge of the camera, and it, in that sense, might be more "quote unquote" authentic in the sense of being able to anticipate what future activity might be. So if some consequences of the turn to preemption, it poses a set of challenges for political responses. In fact, it seeks to bypass the realm of the political unsurprisingly. We can think of some examples. Athena was actually launched as a company that was meant to respond to the issue of school shootings in the US. The idea that if there's not going to be a policy response because the legislature is unable to pass gun control legislation in the US, that there would be a technological system that could operate quickly enough to detect the signs of threat and automatically shut down schools and notify authorities. So it was specifically keyed towards that particular social issue. The figure of the undisciplinable subject, it goes hand in hand with the logic of preemption, right? Prevention only works in the surveillance context if the subjects internalize the monitoring gaze. If the camera doesn't have that effect on them at all, then it becomes useless as a mode of social control. So I'm now going to say a little bit about what the logics of preemption entail, and I'm going to use the next term in my set of biases to discuss that. And one of them is framelessness. And what I mean by framelessness is, I mean, I'm interested in this term, and it first occurred to me when I was thinking about modes of representation that are frameless, the rise of 360-degree cameras, VR, AR, the idea that the frame is no longer in the form of representation, but to the extent that it still exists probably is located in the observer. But then the ambition of being able to represent, outside of the limitations of the frame. But when it comes to information collection, what I mean by framelessness is the absence of any frame that would limit the collection of information or data and displace logics of representation with those of reproduction, if that makes sense, right? Not taking selected slices of reality, but actually redoubling reality in monitored and datafied form. You may have seen Kevin Kelly, the founding editor of Wired magazine, writes a big feature piece every year. And in 2019, it was about augmented reality. And this seemed to be an interesting version of framelessness. He's imagining the next platform is going to be reality itself. And in order for that to happen, you'd have to be able to make a digital map of reality that allowed you to superpose information on it and allow it to be functional for people to interact on in a platform way by creating a map that's as big as a globe. He references Borges here. You need to photograph all places and things from every possible angle all the time, which means you have to have a planet full of cameras that are always on. It's kind of, on a surface, it's a kind of crazy impossible fantasy, right? Because each camera is going to need, I suppose, a camera that tracks the camera. But the very notion of this level of data capture seems to me to align itself with that ambition of framelessness. And you can see where I'm going with this. The notion that's also a model of surveillance perfected. The one that intelligence agencies have been pushing for a while. There's also something going on with the figure of the subject here that I want to say a little bit about when it comes to framelessness. And this is from a product that was advertised as one of the hot new stocks several years ago, and it did not become that. But I saw this ad and I was fascinated by the way in which the appeal was framed. It's a camera that you wear that records all the time, and it's meant to overcome the flaws of your own memory. So this is the marketing copy. How much of your life do you remember? The answer is statistically around 0.001%, and that's if you have good memory. This is about to be changed by a startup called LifeLogger, which could be the next big thing. That notion is quite fascinating to me. The reconfiguring what is, I suppose we might think is one of the features of subjectivity, which is the selective frame, and reconfiguring that as its flaw. What if you could remember everything? So the Borges comes up again, I suppose, if you think of that figure of Funes the Memorious, who was able to remember everything, but couldn't think abstractly because of that, and also it would take him a day to remember a day. But this notion that what the flaw of our memories is actually the flaw of in some ways, I think, our subjectivity. It also raises, of course, the problem, how do you retrieve your memories? Are you going to have to watch a day's worth of video to remember the day? And the solution that they have is actually a biometric one. That this camera would be connected to a system that would monitor your biometric response to particular moments and then would mark the video at those moments, presumably the ones that affected you the most profoundly, and then would allow you to go back and find them. But you could imagine all of the automated solutions to this, a kind of crowdsourcing of memory retrieval. People who liked memories like the one that you just looked at also like memories like these and pull them for you. All of the ways that automated curation intervenes in our environment. This one fascinates me because of its creepiness, but also because of the psychoanalytic character of it. Again, thinking about a particular framing of the subject, the notion that one of the flaws of the subject, I suppose, is those pre-subjective or pre-conscious memories that are hard to retrieve or impossible to retrieve unless you have babe eyes, which is a camera that you would put on a child, presumably the moment they're born, I guess, and that would then capture the memories that child would want later. But what intrigued me about these is the questions in the marketing copy. How did my mother look at me? What was the emotion of my father when he saw me for the first time? It's really kind of, if we just get enough image capture, we can reconstruct the desire of the other, what they want of me. Anyway, I bring that up to suggest that notion of framelessness. I suppose, take into its limit, the goal is a camera that could capture the primal scene. Framelessness also refers to the way I'm thinking about it, the repurposing or the migration of data, the idea that there isn't a limit on what type of data is relevant to what type of prediction that needs to be made. Anything could be relevant to anything. So you've got to collect everything in order to run the automated systems that would allow you to see which patterns emerge. And I see I'm running out of time, so I'm going to just say a couple of quick things and wrap up. The forms of control, if we think back to that logic of cascading automation, the forms of in order to collect these huge amounts of data, you need automated information collection. And I suggested that leads to automated processing and then automated response. And here I'm drawing on the notion of environmentality, thinking about the forms of governance that are associated with these automated systems, and really thinking about systems that don't represent, but that operate. I'm interested in Foucault's comments on environmentality here because of the way in which he invokes the massive withdrawal in that footnote where he describes it in the birth of biopolitics. A massive withdrawal with regard to the normative-disciplinary system. The technology employed is not discipline normalization, but action on the environment. And in here I would juxtapose sorry, I'm going to skip through. I'm a little bit worried about time. Juxtapose the standard surveillance camera as a representational technology to a surveillance camera that's in a convenience store in Tacoma, Washington. And I have a little video here, but basically it's a camera that you've got to stand in front of, and it captures your face, and then it matches it to a database of known shoplifters, and then decides whether or not the door will open. So that notion of actually modulating the space, shutting down or opening access, or intervening in automated ways based on automated data processing, seems to me to move towards what I'm describing as operational logics. Slides are hanging up on me now. And I use, when I'm thinking about operationalism, I'm gesturing towards Harun Faruqi's work on what he calls operative images that are not meant to inform or to entertain, but are actually part of an operation. And he he uses this notion of operationalism to investigate how machines see. I hope I'm not frozen. My slides are frozen. The Trevor Paglen, the artist, goes and tries to recreate some of Haroon Farouki's work looking at machine vision. And what he finds out is that many of the forms of representation that had been generated as part of machinic operations so that humans could see what the machine was doing have been bypassed. The operations have become too complex to be represented, and the result is a kind of opaque automated systems that operate without providing a representation of their action. And I see my slides seem to have just stopped, so I'm going to stop this sharing, and I'll just say a few words if I can get this to work. My apologies. My connection's really bad here. Oh, I see a ton of comments in the, I've got to go through those. So sorry, bad connection. Well, I'll wrap it up by relating some of these ideas to thinking about this theme of autonomy, and I think obviously some of the the ways in which operational systems intervene by bypassing the register of explanation, causation, representation, limit the forms of deliberation, discussion, and political action that would otherwise be possible when it comes to addressing some of the social issues and some of the social processes that are invoked by the forms of automated surveillance that I've been describing, whether these are warfare, thinking about automated forms of military preemption to consumption. But it's really what happens to the fate of representation and its relation to politics that I want to invoke by providing these examples of automated surveillance. And I'll wrap up there. Thanks for your time and attention and patience with the technological issues.